Chapter 41 of Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 41. Gathering Clouds. Mrs. Gibson came back full of rose-coloured accounts of London. Lady Cumnor had been gracious and affectionate, so touched by my going up to see her so soon after her return to England. Lady Harriet charming and devoted to her old governess. Lord Cumnor just like his dear usual hearty self. And as for the Kirkpatricks, no Lord Chancellor's house was ever grander than theirs, and the silk gown of the Q.C. had floated over housemaids and footmen. Cynthia, too, was much admired, and as for her dress, Mrs. Kirkpatrick had showered down ball dresses and wreaths, and pretty bonnets and mantles, like a fairy godmother. Mr. Gibson's poor present of £10 shrank into very small dimensions, compared with all this munificence. "And they're so fond of her, I don't know when we shall have her back," was Mrs. Gibson's winding-up sentence. "And now, Molly, what have you and papa been doing? Very gay you sounded in your letter. I had not time to read it in London, so I put it in my pocket, and read it in the coach coming home. But, my dear child, you do look so old-fashioned, with your gown made all tight, and your hair all tumbling about in curls. Curls are quite gone out. We must do your hair differently," she continued, trying to smooth Molly's black waves into straightness. "I sent Cynthia an African letter," said Molly timidly. "Did you hear anything of what was in it?" "Oh, yes, poor child! It made her very uneasy, I think. She said she did not feel inclined to go to Mr. Rawson's ball, which was on that night, and for which Mrs. Kirkpatrick had given her the ball-dress. But there was really nothing for her to fidget about. Roger only said he had had another touch of fever, but was better when he wrote. He says every European has to be acclimatized by fever in that part of Abyssinia where he is." "And did she go?" asked Molly. "Yes, to be sure. It is not an engagement, and if it were, it is not acknowledged. Fancy her going and saying, 'A young man that I know has been ill for a few days in Africa, 2 months ago, and therefore I don't want to go to the ball to-night.' It would have seemed like affectation of sentiment, and if there's one thing I hate, it is that." "She would hardly enjoy herself," said Molly. "Oh yes, but she did. Her dress was white gauze, trimmed with lilacs, and she really did look—a mother may be allowed a little natural partiality—most lovely. And she danced every dance, although she was quite a stranger. I am sure she enjoyed herself, from her manner of talking about it next morning." "I wonder if the squire knows." "Knows what? Oh yes, to be sure, you mean about Roger. I dare say he doesn't, and there's no need to tell him, for I've no doubt it is all right now." And she went out of the room to finish her unpacking. Molly let her work fall and sighed. "It will be a year the day after to-morrow since he came here to propose our going to Hurst Wood, and mamma was so vexed at his calling before lunch. I wonder if Cynthia remembers it as well as I do. And now, perhaps— Oh, Roger, Roger, I pray that you were safe home again. How could we all bear it if—" She covered her face with her hands, and tried to stop thinking. Suddenly she got up, as if stung by a venomous fancy. "I don't believe she loves him as she ought, or she could not have gone and danced. What shall I do if she does not? What shall I do? I can bear anything but that." But she found the long suspense as to his health hard enough to endure. They were not likely to hear from him for a month at least, and before that time had elapsed, Cynthia would be at home again. Molly learnt to long for her return before a fortnight of her absence was over. She had had no idea that perpetual tete-a-tetes with Mrs. Gibson could, by any possibility, be so tiresome as she found them. Perhaps Molly's state of delicate health, consequent upon her rapid growth during the last few months, made her irritable. but really, often she had to get up and leave the room to calm herself down after listening to a long series of words, more frequently plaintive or discontented in tone than cheerful, and which at the end conveyed no distinct impression of either the speaker's thought or feeling. Whenever anything had gone wrong, whenever Mr Gibson had coolly persevered in anything to which she had objected, whenever the cook had made a mistake about the dinner, or the housemaid broken any little frangible article, whenever Molly's hair was not done to her liking, or her dress did not become her, or the smell of dinner pervaded the house, or the wrong callers came, or the right callers did not come, in fact, whenever anything went wrong, poor Mr Kirkpatrick was regretted and mourned over, nay, almost blamed, as if, had he only given himself the trouble of living, he could have helped it. When I look back to those happy days, it seems to me as if I had never valued them as I ought. To be sure, youth, love, what did we care for poverty? I remember dear Mr Kirkpatrick walking 5 miles into Stratford to buy me a muffin, because I had a fancy for one after Cynthia was born. I don't mean to complain of dear papa, but I don't think, but perhaps I ought not to say it to you, if Mr Kirkpatrick had but taken care of that cough of his, but he was so obstinate. Men always are, I think, and it really was selfish of him. Only I dare say he did not consider the forlorn state in which I should be left. It came harder upon me than upon most people, because I always was of such an affectionate, sensitive nature. I remember a little poem of Mr Kirkpatrick's, in which he compared my heart to a harp-string vibrating to the slightest breeze. I thought harp-strings required a pretty strong finger to make them sound, said Molly. Oh, my dear child, you've no more poetry in you than your father. And as for your hair, it's worse than ever. Can't you drench it in water to take those untidy twists and twirls out of it? It only makes it curl more and more when it gets dry, said Molly, sudden tears coming into her eyes as a recollection came before her, like a picture seen long ago and forgotten for years, a young mother washing and dressing her little girl, placing the half-naked darling on her knee, and twining the wet rings of dark hair fondly round her fingers, and then, in an ecstasy of fondness, kissing the little curly head. The receipt of Cynthia's letters made very agreeable events. She did not write often, but her letters were tolerably long when they did come, and very sprightly in tone. There was constant mention made of many new names, which conveyed no idea to Molly, though Mrs Gibson would try and enlighten her by running commentaries like the following. Mrs Green! Ah, that's Mr Jones's pretty cousin, who lives in Russell Square with the fat husband. They keep their carriage, but I'm not sure if it is not Mr Green who is a Mrs Jones's cousin. We can ask Cynthia when she comes home. Mr Henderson, to be sure, a young man with black whiskers, a pupil of Mr Kirkpatrick's formerly, or was he a pupil of Mr Murray's? I know they said he had read law with somebody. Oh, yes, they are the people who called the day after Mr Rawson's ball, and who admired Cynthia so much, without knowing I was her mother. She was very handsomely dressed indeed, in black satin, and the son had a glass eye, but he was a young man of good property. Coleman, yes, that was the name. No more news of Roger until some time after Cynthia had returned from her London visit. She came back looking fresher and prettier than ever, beautifully dressed, thanks to her own good taste and her cousin's generosity, full of amusing details of the gay life she had been enjoying, yet not at all out of spirits at having left it behind her. She brought home all sorts of pretty and dainty devices for Molly, a neck-ribbon made up in the newest fashion, a pattern for a tippet, a delicate pair of light gloves, embroidered as Molly had never seen gloves embroidered before, and many another little sign of remembrance during her absence. Yet somehow or other Molly felt that Cynthia was changed in her relation to her. Molly was aware that she had never had Cynthia's full confidence, for with all her apparent frankness and naivete of manner, Cynthia was extremely reserved and reticent. She knew this much of herself, and had often laughed about it to Molly, and the latter had by this time found out the truth of her friend's assertion. But Molly did not trouble herself much about it. She, too, knew that there were many thoughts and feelings that flitted through her mind which she should never think of telling to any one, except, perhaps, if they were very much thrown together, to her father. She knew that Cynthia withheld from her more than thoughts and feelings, that she withheld facts. But then, as Molly reflected, these facts might involve details of struggle and suffering, might relate to her mother's neglect, and altogether be of so painful a character that it would be well if Cynthia could forget her childhood altogether, instead of fixing it in her mind by the relation of her grievances and troubles. So it was not now by any want of confidence that Molly felt distanced, as it were. It was because Cynthia rather avoided than sought her companionship, because her eyes shunned the straight, serious, loving look of Molly's, because there were certain subjects on which she evidently disliked speaking, not particularly interesting things, as far as Molly could perceive, but it almost seemed as if they lay on the road to points to be avoided. Molly felt a sort of sighing pleasure in noticing Cynthia's changed manner of talking about Roger. She spoke of him tenderly now, poor Roger, as she called him, and Molly thought that she must be referring to the illness which he had mentioned in his last letter. One morning in the first week after Cynthia's return home, just as he was going out, Mr. Gibson ran up into the drawing-room, hat on, booted and spurred, and hastily laid an open pamphlet down before her, pointing out a particular passage with his finger, but not speaking a word before he rapidly quitted the room. His eyes were sparkling, and had an amused as well as pleased expression. All this Molly noticed, as well as Cynthia's flush of colour as she read what was thus pointed out to her. Then she pushed it a little on one side, not closing the book, however, and went on with her work. "What is it? May I see it?" asked Molly, stretching out her hand for the pamphlet, which lay within her reach. But she did not take it until Cynthia had said, "Certainly, I don't suppose there are any great secrets in a scientific journal, full of reports of meetings." And she gave the book a little push towards Molly. "Oh, Cynthia!" said Molly, catching her breath as she read, "are you not proud?" For it was an account of an annual gathering of the Geographical Society, and Lord Hollingford had read a letter he had received from Roger Hamley, dated from Aracuba, a district in Africa, hitherto unvisited by any intelligent European traveller, and about which Mr. Hamley sent many curious particulars. The reading of this letter had been received with the greatest interest, and several subsequent speakers had paid the writer very high compliments. But Molly might have known Cynthia better than to expect an answer responsive to the feelings that prompted her question. Let Cynthia be ever so proud, ever so glad, or so grateful, or even indignant, remorseful, grieved, or sorry, the very fact that she was expected by another to entertain any of these emotions would have been enough to prevent her expressing them. "I'm afraid I am not as much struck by the wonder of the thing as you are, Molly. Besides, it is not news to me. At least, not entirely. I heard about the meeting before I left London. It was a good deal talked about in my uncle's set. To be sure, I didn't hear all the fine things they say of him there, but then, you know, that's a mere fashion of speaking, which means nothing. Somebody is bound to pay compliments when a lord takes the trouble to read one of his letters aloud." "Nonsense," said Molly. "You know you don't believe what you are saying, Cynthia." Cynthia gave that pretty little jerk of her shoulders, which was her equivalent for a French shrug, but she did not lift up her head from her sewing. Molly began to read the report over again. "Why, Cynthia," she said, "you might have been there. Ladies were there. It says many ladies were present. Oh, couldn't you have managed to go? If your uncle's set cared about these things, wouldn't some of them have taken you?" "Perhaps, if I had asked them, but I think they would have been rather astonished at my sudden turn for science." "You might have told your uncle how matters really stood. He wouldn't have talked about it if you had wished him not, I am sure, and he could have helped you." "Once for all, Molly," said Cynthia, now laying down her work and speaking with quick authority, "do learn to understand that it is and always has been my wish not to have the relation which Roger and I bear to each other mentioned or talked about. When the right time comes, I will make it known to my uncle, and to everybody whom it may concern, but I am not going to make mischief and get myself into trouble, even for the sake of hearing compliments paid to him, and by letting out before the time. If I'm pushed to it, I'd sooner break it off altogether at once, and have done with it. I can't be worse off than I am now." Her angry tone had changed into a kind of desponding complaint before she had ended her sentence. Molly looked at her with dismay. I can't understand you, Cynthia, she said at length. No, I dare say you can't, said Cynthia, looking at her with tears in her eyes, and very tenderly, as if in atonement for her late vehemence. I am afraid, I hope you never will. In a moment Molly's arms were round her. Oh, Cynthia, she murmured, have I been plaguing you? Have I vexed you? Don't say you're afraid of my knowing you. Of course you've your faults, everybody has, but I think I love you the better for them. I don't know that I am so very bad, said Cynthia, smiling a little through the tears that Molly's words and caresses had forced to overflow from her eyes. But I have got into scrapes. I'm in a scrape now. I do sometimes believe I shall always be in scrapes, and if they ever come to light, I shall seem to be worse than I really am. And I know your father will throw me off, and no, I won't be afraid that you will, Molly. I'm sure I won't. Do you think, how would Roger take it? Asked Molly very timidly. I don't know. I hope he will never hear of it. I don't see why he should, for in a little while I shall be quite clear again. It all came about without my ever thinking I was doing wrong. I've a great mind to tell you all about it, Molly. Molly did not like to urge it, though she longed to know, and to see if she could not offer help. But while Cynthia was hesitating, and perhaps, to say the truth, rather regretting that she had even made this slight advance towards bestowing her confidence, Mrs Gibson came in, full of some manner of altering a gown of hers, so as to make it into the fashion of the day, as she had seen it during her visit to London. Cynthia seemed to forget her tears and her troubles, and to throw her whole soul into millinery. Cynthia's correspondence went on pretty briskly with her London cousins, according to the usual rate of correspondence in those days. Indeed, Mrs Gibson was occasionally inclined to complain of the frequency of Helen Kirkpatrick's letters, for before the penny post came in, the recipient had to pay the postage of letters, and 11 halfpenny 3 times a week came, according to Mrs Gibson's mode of reckoning when annoyed, to a sum between 3 and 4 shillings. But these complaints were only for the family. They saw the wrong side of the tapestry. Hollingford in general, Miss Brownings in particular, heard of dear Helen's enthusiastic friendship for Cynthia, and of the real pleasure it was to receive such constant news, relays of news, indeed, from London. It was almost as good as living there. A great deal better, I should think, said Miss Browning with some severity, for she had got many of her notions of the metropolis from the British essayists, where town is so often represented as the centre of dissipation, corrupting country wives and squires' daughters, and unfitting them for all their duties by the constant whirl of its not always innocent pleasures. London was a sort of moral pitch, which few could touch and not be defiled. Miss Browning had been on the watch for the signs of deterioration in Cynthia's character ever since her return home. But, except in a greater number of pretty and becoming articles of dress, there was no great change for the worse to be perceived. Cynthia had been in the world, had beheld the glare and glitter and dazzling display of London, yet had come back to Hollingford as ready as ever to place a chair for Miss Browning, or to gather flowers for a nosegay for Miss Phoebe, or to mend her own clothes. But all this was set down to the merits of Cynthia, not to the credit of London town. "As far as I can judge of London," said Miss Browning, sententiously continuing her tirade against the place, "it's no better than a pickpocket and a robber dressed up in the spoils of honest folk. I should like to know where my Lord Hollingford was bred, and Mr Roger Hamley. Your good husband lent me that report of the meeting, Mrs Gibson, where so much was said about them both, and he was as proud of their praise as if he had been akin to them, and Phoebe read it aloud to me, for the print was too small for my eyes. She was a good deal perplexed with all the new names of places, but I said she had better skip them all, for we had never heard of them before, and probably should never hear of them again. But she read out the fine things they said of my lord, and Mr Roger, and I put it to you, where were they born and bred? Why, within 8 miles of Hollingford. It might have been Molly there, or me, it's all a chance. And then they go and talk about the pleasures of intellectual society in London, and the distinguished people up there that it is such an advantage to know, and all the time I know it's only shops and the play that's the real attraction. But that's neither here nor there. We put our best foot foremost, and if we have a reason to give that look sensible, we speak it out like men, and never say anything about the silliness we are hugging to our hearts.
But I ask you again, where does this fine society come from, and these wise men, and these distinguished travellers? Why, out of country parishes like this. London picks 'em all up and decks herself with 'em, and then calls out loud to the folks she's robbed, and says, 'Come and see how fine I am.' Fine indeed! I've no patience with London. Cynthia is much better out of it, and I'm not sure, if I were you, Mrs Gibson, if I wouldn't stop up those London letters. They'll only be unsettling her."
"But perhaps she may live in London some of these days, Miss Browning," simpered Mrs Gibson.
"Time enough then to be thinking of London. I wish her an honest country husband, with enough to live upon, and a little to lay by, and a good character to boot. Mind that, Molly," said she, firing round upon the startled Molly. "I wish Cynthia a husband with a good character, but she's got a mother to look after her, you've none, and when your mother was alive she was a dear friend of mine, so I'm not going to let you throw yourself away upon any one whose life isn't clear and above board, you may depend upon it."
This last speech fell like a bomb into the quiet little drawing-room, it was delivered with such vehemence. Miss Browning, in her secret heart, meant it as a warning against the intimacy she believed that Molly had formed with Mr. Preston. But as it happened that Molly had never dreamed of any such intimacy, the girl could not imagine why such severity of speech should be addressed to her. Mrs. Gibson, who always took up the points of every word or action where they touched her own self, and called it sensitiveness, broke the silence that followed Miss Browning's speech by saying plaintively, "I'm sure, Miss Browning, you are very much mistaken if you think that any mother could take more care of Molly than I do. I don't. I can't think there is any need for any one to interfere to protect her, and I have not an idea why you have been talking in this way, just as if we were all wrong, and you were all right. It hurts my feelings, that it does, for Molly can tell you there is not a thing or a favour that Cynthia has that she has not. And as for not taking care of her, why, if she were to go up to London to-morrow, I should make a point of going with her to see after her, and I never did it for Cynthia when she was at school in France, and her bedroom is furnished just like Cynthia's, and I let her wear my red shawl whenever she likes. She might have it oftener if she would. I can't think what you mean, Miss Browning." "I did not mean to offend you, but I meant just to give Molly a hint. She understands what I mean." "I'm sure I don't," said Molly boldly. "I haven't a notion what you meant, if you were alluding to anything more than you said straight out, that you do not wish me to marry any one who hasn't a good character, and that, as you were a friend of mamma's, you would prevent my marrying a man with a bad character by every means in your power. I'm not thinking of marrying, I don't want to marry anybody at all, but if I did, and he were not a good man, I should thank you for coming and warning me of it." "I shall not stand on warning you, Molly. I shall forbid the banns in church, if need be," said Miss Browning, half convinced of the clear, transparent truth of what Molly had said, blushing all over, it is true, but with her eyes steadily fixed on Miss Browning's face while she spoke. "Do," said Molly. "Well, well, I won't say any more. Perhaps I was mistaken. We won't say any more about it. But remember what I have said, Molly. There's no harm in that, at any rate. I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, Mrs. Gibson. As stepmothers go, I think you try and do your duty. Good morning. Good-bye to you both, and God bless you." If Miss Browning thought that her final blessing would secure peace in the room she was leaving, she was very much mistaken. Mrs. Gibson burst out with, "Try and do my duty, indeed! I should be much obliged to you, Molly, if you would take care not to behave in such a manner as to bring down upon me such impertinence as I have just been receiving from Miss Browning." "But I don't know what made her talk as she did, mamma," said Molly. "I'm sure I don't know, and I don't care either. But I know that I was never spoken to as if I was trying to do my duty before. Trying, indeed! Everybody always knew that I did it, without talking about it before my face in that rude manner. I've that deep feeling about duty that I think it ought to be only talked about in church, and in such sacred places as that, not to have a common caller startling one with it, even though she was an early friend of your mother's. And as if I didn't look after you quite as much as I look after Cynthia. Why, it was only yesterday I went up into Cynthia's room and found her reading a letter that she put away in a hurry as soon as I came in, and I didn't even ask her who it was from, and I'm sure I should have made you tell me." Very likely. Mrs. Gibson shrank from any conflict with Cynthia, pretty sure that she would be worsted in the end, while Molly generally submitted sooner than have any struggle for her own will. Just then Cynthia came in. "What's the matter?" said she quickly,
seeing that something was wrong. "Why, Molly has been doing something which has set that impertinent Miss Browning off into lecturing me on trying to do my duty. If your poor father had but lived, Cynthia, I should never have been spoken to as I have been. A stepmother trying to do her duty, indeed! That was Miss Browning's expression." Any allusion to her father took from Cynthia all desire of irony. She came forward, and again asked Molly what was the matter. Molly, herself ruffled, made answer, "Miss Browning seemed to think I was likely to marry someone whose character was objectionable." "You, Molly?" said Cynthia. "Yes, she once before spoke to me. I suspect she has got some notion about Mr. Preston in her head." Cynthia sat down quite suddenly. Molly went on. "And she spoke as if mamma did not look enough after me. I think she was rather provoking." "Not rather, but very, very impertinent," said Mrs. Gibson, a little soothed by Molly's recognition of her grievance. "What could have put it into her head?" said Cynthia very quietly, taking up her sewing as she spoke. "I don't know," said her mother, replying to the question after her own fashion. "I'm sure I don't always approve of Mr. Preston, but even if it was him she was thinking about, he's far more agreeable than she is, and I'd much rather have him coming to call than an old maid like her any day." "I don't know that it was Mr. Preston she was thinking about," said Molly. "It was only a guess. When you were both in London she spoke about him. I thought she had heard something about you and him, Cynthia." Unseen by her mother, Cynthia looked up at Molly, her eyes full of prohibition, her cheeks full of angry colour. Molly stopped short suddenly. After that look she was surprised at the quietness with which Cynthia said, almost immediately, "Well, after all, it is only your fancy that she was alluding to Mr. Preston, so perhaps we had better not say any more about him. And as for her advice to mamma to look after you better, Miss Molly, I'll stand bail for your good behaviour, for both mamma and I know you're the last person to do any foolish things in that way. And now don't let us talk any more about it. I was coming to tell you that Hannah Brand's little boy has been badly burnt, and his sister is downstairs asking for old linen." Mrs. Gibson was always kind to poor people, and she immediately got up and went to her stores to search for the article wanted. Cynthia turned quietly round to Molly. "Molly, pray don't ever allude to anything between me and Mr. Preston, not to mamma, not to any one. Never do. I've a reason for it. Don't say anything more about it, ever." Mrs. Gibson came back at this moment, and Molly had to stop short again on the brink of Cynthia's confidence, uncertain indeed this time whether she would have been told anything more, and only sure that she had annoyed Cynthia a good deal. But the time was approaching when she would know all. End of chapter 41. Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 42. The Storm Bursts. The autumn drifted away through all its seasons. The golden corn harvest, the walks through the stubble fields, and rambles into hazel copses in search of nuts. The stripping of the apple orchards of their ruddy fruit, amid the joyous cries and shouts of watching children, and the gorgeous tulip-like colouring of the later time had now come on with the shortening days. There was comparative silence in the land, excepting for the distant shots, and the whir of the partridges as they rose up from the field. Ever since Miss Browning's unlucky conversation, things had been ajar in the Gibsons' house. Cynthia seemed to keep every one out at mental arm's length, and particularly avoided any private talks with Molly. Mrs. Gibson, still cherishing a grudge against Miss Browning for her implied accusation of not looking enough after Molly, chose to exercise a most wearying supervision over the poor girl. It was, "Where have you been, child? Who did you see? Who was that letter from? Why were you so long out, when you had only to go to so-and-so?" Just as if Molly had really been detected in carrying on some underhand intercourse. She answered every question asked of her with the simple truthfulness of perfect innocence, but the inquiries, although she read their motive, she knew that they arose from no especial suspicion of her conduct, but only that Mrs. Gibson might be able to say she looked after her well, chafed her inexpressibly. Very often she did not go out at all, sooner than have to give a plan of her intended proceedings, when perhaps she had no plan at all, only thought of wandering out at her own sweet will, and of taking pleasure in the bright solemn fading of the year. It was a very heavy time for Molly. Zest and life had fled, and left so many of the old delights mere shells of seeming. She thought it was that her youth had fled, at 19. Cynthia was no longer the same somehow, and perhaps Cynthia's change would injure her in the distant Roger's opinion. Her stepmother seemed almost kind in comparison with Cynthia's withdrawal of her heart. Mrs. Gibson worried her, to be sure, with all these forms of watching over her, but in all her other ways she at any rate was the same. Yet Cynthia herself seemed anxious and careworn, though she would not speak of her anxieties to Molly. And then the poor girl in her goodness would blame herself for feeling Cynthia's change of manner, for, as Molly said to herself, "If it is hard work for me to help always fretting after Roger, and wondering where he is, and how he is, what must it be for her?"
One day Mr. Gibson came in, bright and swift.
"Molly," said he, "where's Cynthia?"
"Gone out to do some errands."
"Well, it's a pity, but never mind. Put on your bonnet and cloak as fast as you can. I've had to borrow old Simpson's dog-cart. There would have been room both for you and Cynthia, but as it is, you must walk back alone. I'll drive you as far on the Barford Road as I can, and then you must jump down. I can't take you on to Broadhurst's. I may be kept there for hours."
Mrs. Gibson was out of the room, out of the house, it might be, for all Molly cared, now she had her father's leave and command. Her bonnet and cloak were on in 2 minutes, and she was sitting by her father's side, the back seat shut up, and the light weight going swiftly and merrily bumping over the stone-paved lanes. "Oh, this is charming," said Molly, after a toss-up on her seat from a tremendous bump.
"For youth, but not for crabbed age," said Mr. Gibson. "My bones are getting rheumatic, and would rather go smoothly over macadamized streets."
"That's treason to this lovely view, and this fine pure air, papa, only I don't believe you."
"Thank you, and as you are so complimentary, I think I shall put you down at the foot of this hill. We've passed the second milestone from Hollingford."
"Oh, let me just go up to the top. I know we can see the blue range of the Malverns from it, and Dorrimer Hill among the woods. The horse will want a minute's rest, and then I will get down without a word." So she went up to the top of the hill, and there they sat still a minute or two, enjoying the view without much speaking. The woods were golden, the old house of purple-red brick, with its twisted chimneys, rose up from among them, facing on to green lawns and a placid lake. Beyond again were the Malvern Hills.
"Now jump down, lassie, and make the best of your way home before it gets dark. You'll find the cut over Croston Heath shorter than the road we've come by."
To get to Croston Heath, Molly had to go down a narrow lane overshadowed by trees, with picturesque old cottages dotted here and there on the steep sandy banks, and then there came a small wood, and then there was a brook to be crossed on a plank bridge, and up the steeper fields on the opposite side were cut steps in the turfy path. These ended, she was on Croston Heath, a wide-stretching common skirted by labourers' dwellings, past which a near road to Hollingford lay. The loneliest part of the road was the first, the lane, the wood, the little bridge, and the clambering through the upland fields. But Molly cared little for loneliness. She went along the lane under the overarching elm branches, from which here and there a yellow leaf came floating down upon her very dress, past the last cottage where a little child had tumbled down the sloping bank, and was publishing the accident with frightened cries. Molly stooped to pick it up, and taking it in her arms in a manner which caused intense surprise to take the place of alarm in its little breast, she carried it up the rough flag steps toward the cottage, which she supposed to be its home. The mother came running in from the garden behind the house, still holding the late damsons she had been gathering in her apron, but on seeing her, the little creature held out its arms to go to her, and she dropped her damsons all about as she took it, and began to soothe it as it cried afresh, interspersing her lulling with thanks to Molly. She called her by her name, and on Molly asking the woman how she came to know it, she replied that before her marriage she had been a servant of Mrs. Goodenough, and so was bound to know Dr. Gibson's daughter by sight.
After the exchange of 2 or 3 more words, Molly ran down into the lane and pursued her way, stopping here and there to gather a nosegay of such leaves as struck her for their brilliant colouring. She entered the wood. As she turned a corner in the lonely path, she heard a passionate voice of distress, and in an instant recognized Cynthia's tones. She stood still, and looked around. There were some thick holly bushes shining out dark green in the midst of the amber and scarlet foliage. If any one was there, it must be behind these thick bushes. So Molly left the path and went straight, plunging through the brown tangled growth of ferns and underwood, and turned the holly bushes. There stood Mr. Preston and Cynthia, he holding her hands tight, each looking as if just silenced in some vehement talk by the rustle of Molly's footsteps. For an instant no one spoke. Then Cynthia said, "Oh, Molly, Molly, come and judge between us." Mr. Preston let go Cynthia's hand slowly, with a look that was more of a sneer than a smile, and yet he too had been strongly agitated, whatever was the subject in dispute. Molly came forward and took Cynthia's arm, her eyes steadily fixed on Mr. Preston's face. It was fine to see the fearlessness of her perfect innocence. He could not bear her look, and said to Cynthia, "The subject of our conversation does not well admit of a third person's presence. As Miss Gibson seems to wish for your company now, I must beg you to fix some other time and place where we can finish our discussion." "I will go, if Cynthia wishes me," said Molly. "No, no, stay. I want you to stay. I want you to hear it all. I wish I had told you sooner." "You mean that you regret that she has not been made aware of our engagement, that you promised long ago to be my wife? Pray remember that it was you who made me promise secrecy, not I you." "I don't believe him, Cynthia. Don't cry if you can help it. I don't believe him."
"Cynthia,"
said he, suddenly changing his tone to fervid tenderness,
pray do not go on so. You can't think how it distresses me."
He stepped forward to try and take her hand and soothe her, but she shrank away from him, and sobbed the more irrepressibly. She felt Molly's presence so much to be a protection, that now she dared to let herself go, and to weaken herself by giving way to her emotion. "Go away," said Molly. "Don't you see you make her worse?" But he did not stir. He was looking at Cynthia so intently that he did not even seem to hear her. "Go," said Molly vehemently. "If it really distresses you to see her cry, don't you see it is you who are the cause of it?"
"I will go, if Cynthia tells me,"
said he at length.
"Oh, Molly, I don't know what to do,"
said Cynthia, taking down her hands from her tear-stained face, and appealing to Molly, and sobbing worse than ever. In fact, she became hysterical, and though she tried to speak coherently, no intelligible words would come. "Run to that cottage in the trees, and fetch her a cup of water," said Molly. He hesitated a little. "Why don't you go?" said Molly impatiently.
"I have not done speaking to her. You will not leave before I come back?"
"No. Don't you see she can't move in this state?" He went quickly, if reluctantly. Cynthia was some time before she could check her sobs enough to speak. At length she said,
"Molly, I do hate him."
"But what did he mean by saying you were engaged to him? Don't cry, dear, but tell me. If I can help you, I will, but I can't imagine what it all really is."
"It's too long a story to tell now, and I'm not strong enough. Look, he's coming back. As soon as I can, let us get home."
"With all my heart," said Molly. He brought the water, and Cynthia drank, and was restored to calmness. "Now," said Molly, "we had better go home as fast as you can manage it. It's getting dark quickly." If she hoped to carry Cynthia off so easily, she was mistaken. Mr. Preston was resolute on this point. He said, "I think, since Miss Gibson has made herself acquainted with this much, we had better let her know the whole truth, that you are engaged to marry me as soon as you are 20. Otherwise your being here with me, and by appointment too, may appear strange, even equivocal to her." "As I know that Cynthia is engaged to another man, you can hardly expect me to believe what you say, Mr. Preston."
"Oh, Molly,"
said Cynthia, trembling all over, but trying to be calm.
"I am not engaged, neither to the person you mean, nor to Mr. Preston."
Mr. Preston forced a smile.
I think I have some letters that would convince Miss Gibson of the truth of what I have said, and which will convince Mr. Osborne Hamley, if necessary. I conclude it is to him she is alluding."
"I am quite puzzled by you both," said Molly. "The only thing I do know is, that we ought not to be standing here at this time of evening, and that Cynthia and I should go home directly. If you want to talk to Miss Kirkpatrick, Mr. Preston, why don't you come to my father's house, and ask to see her openly, and like a gentleman?"
"I am perfectly willing," said he. "I shall only be too glad to explain to Mr. Gibson on what terms I stand in relation to her. If I have not done it sooner, it is because I have yielded to her wishes."
"Pray, pray don't. Molly, you don't know all, you don't know anything about it. You mean well and kindly, I know, but you are only making mischief. I am quite well enough to walk. Do let us go. I will tell you all about it when we are at home."
She took Molly's arm and tried to hasten her away, but Mr. Preston followed, talking as he walked by their side.
"I do not know what you will say at home, but can you deny that you are my promised wife? Can you deny that it has only been at your earnest request that I have kept the engagement secret so long?"
He was unwise. Cynthia stopped and turned at bay.
"Since you will have it out, since I must speak here, I own that what you say is literally true, that when I was a neglected girl of 16, you, whom I believed to be a friend, lent me money at my need, and made me give you a promise of marriage."
"Made you?"
said he, laying an emphasis on the first word. Cynthia turned scarlet.
"Made is not the right word, I confess. I liked you then. You were almost my only friend, and if it had been a question of immediate marriage, I dare say I should never have objected. But I know you better now, and you have persecuted me so of late, that I tell you once for all, as I have told you before, till I am sick of the very words, that nothing shall ever make me marry you, nothing. I see there's no chance of escaping exposure, and I dare say losing my character, and I know losing all the few friends I have."
"Never me," said Molly, touched by the wailing tone of despair that Cynthia was falling into.
"It is hard," said Mr. Preston. "You may believe all the bad things you like about me, Cynthia, but I don't think you can doubt my real, passionate, disinterested love for you."
"I do doubt it," said Cynthia, breaking out with fresh energy. "Ah, when I think of the self-denying affection I have seen, I have known, affection that thought of others before itself—"
Mr. Preston broke in at the pause she made. She was afraid of revealing too much to him.
"You do not call it love which has been willing to wait for years, to be silent while silence was desired, to suffer jealousy and to bear neglect, relying on the solemn promise of a girl of 16, for solemn, say flimsy, when that girl grows older. Cynthia, I have loved you, and I do love you, and I won't give you up. If you will but keep your word and marry me, I'll swear I'll make you love me in return."
"Oh, I wish I'd never borrowed that unlucky money. It was the beginning of it all. Oh, Molly, I have scrimped and saved to repay it, and he won't take it now. I thought if I could but repay it, it would set me free."
"You seem to imply you sold yourself to me for £20,"
he said. They were nearly on the common now, close to the protection of the cottages, in very hearing of their inmates. If neither of the other two thought of this, Molly did, and resolved in her mind to call in at one of them, and ask for the labourer's protection home. At any rate, his presence must put a stop to this miserable altercation.
"I did not sell myself. I liked you then. But oh, how I do hate you now!"
cried Cynthia, unable to contain her words. He bowed and turned back, vanishing rapidly down the field staircase. At any rate, that was a relief. Yet the two girls hastened on, as if he was still rapidly pursuing them. Once, when Molly said something to Cynthia, the latter replied,
"Molly, if you pity me, if you love me, don't say anything more just now. We shall have to look as if nothing had happened when we get home. Come to my room when we go upstairs to bed, and I'll tell you all. I know you'll blame me terribly, but I will tell you all."
So Molly did not say another word till they reached home, and then, comparatively at ease, inasmuch as no one perceived how late was their return to the house, each of the girls went up into their separate rooms, to rest and calm themselves before dressing for the necessary family gathering at dinner. Molly felt as if she were so miserably shaken that she could not have gone down at all, if her own interests only had been at stake. She sat by her dressing-table, holding her head in her hands, her candles unlighted and the room in darkness, trying to still her beating heart, and to recall all she had heard, and what would be its bearing on the lives of those whom she loved. Roger! Oh, Roger! Far away in mysterious darkness of distance, loving as he did. Ah, that was love! That was the love to which Cynthia had referred as worthy of the name, and the object of his love claimed by another. False to one she must be. How could it be? What would he think and feel if he ever came to know it? It was of no use trying to imagine his pain, that could do no good. What lay before Molly was to try and extricate Cynthia, if she could help her by thought or advice or action, not to weaken herself by letting her fancy run into pictures of possible, probable suffering. When she went into the drawing-room before dinner, she found Cynthia and her mother by themselves. There were candles in the room, but they were not lighted, for the wood fire blazed merrily, if fitfully, and they were awaiting Mr. Gibson's return, which might be expected at any minute. Cynthia sat in the shade, so it was only by her sensitive ear that Molly could judge of her state of composure. Mrs. Gibson was telling some of her day's adventures, whom she had found at home in the calls she had been making, who had been out, and the small pieces of news she had heard. To Molly's quick sympathy Cynthia's voice sounded languid and weary, but she made all the proper replies, and expressed the proper interest at the right places, and Molly came to the rescue, chiming in, with an effort it is true, but Mrs. Gibson was not one to notice slight shades or differences in manner. When Mr. Gibson returned, the relative positions of the parties were altered. It was Cynthia now who raised herself into liveliness, partly from a consciousness that he would have noticed any depression, and partly because Cynthia was one of those natural coquettes who, from their cradle to their grave, instinctively bring out all their prettiest airs and graces in order to stand well with any man, young or old, who may happen to be present. She listened to his remarks and stories with all the sweet intentness of happier days, till Molly, silent and wondering, could hardly believe that Cynthia before her was the same girl as she who was sobbing and crying as if her heart would break but 2 hours before. It is true she looked pale and heavy-eyed, but that was the only sign she gave of her past trouble, which yet must be a present care, thought Molly. After dinner Mr. Gibson went out to his town patients. Mrs. Gibson subsided into her armchair, holding a sheet of the Times before her, behind which she took a quiet and ladylike doze. Cynthia had a book in one hand, with the other she shaded her eyes from the light. Molly alone could neither read, nor sleep, nor work. She sat in the seat in the bow window. The blind was not drawn down, for there was no danger of their being overlooked. She gazed into the soft outer darkness, and found herself striving to discern the outlines of objects, the cottage at the end of the garden, the great beech tree with the seat round it, the wire arches, of which the summer roses had clambered, each came out faint and dim against the dusky velvet of the atmosphere. Presently tea came, and there was the usual nightly bustle. The table was cleared, Mrs. Gibson roused herself, and made the same remark about dear papa that she had done at the same hour for weeks past. Cynthia, too, did not look different from usual. And yet what a hidden mystery did her calmness hide, thought Molly. At length came bedtime, with the customary little speeches. Both Molly and Cynthia went to their own rooms without exchanging a word. When Molly was in hers she had forgotten whether she was to go to Cynthia, or Cynthia to come to her. She took off her gown and put on her dressing-gown, and stood and waited, and even sat down for a minute or two. But Cynthia did not come. So Molly went and knocked at the opposite door, which to her surprise she found shut. When she entered the room, Cynthia sat by her dressing-table, just as she had come up from the drawing-room. She had been leaning her head on her arms, and seemed almost to have forgotten the tryst she had made with Molly, for she looked up as if startled, and her face did seem full of worry and distress. In her solitude she made no more exertion, but gave way to thoughts of care. Chapter 42.
Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 43. Cynthia's Confession.
"You said I might come," said Molly, "and that you would tell me all." You know all, I think, said Cynthia heavily. Perhaps you don't know what excuses I have, but at any rate you know what a scrape I am in. I've been thinking a great deal, said Molly timidly and doubtfully, and I can't help fancying if you told papa. Before she could go on, Cynthia had stood up. No, said she, that I won't, unless I'm to leave here at once. And you know I have not another place to go to, without warning, I mean. I dare say my uncle would take me in. He's a relation, and would be bound to stand by me in whatever disgrace I might be, or perhaps I might get a governess's situation. A pretty governess I should be. Pray, please, Cynthia, don't go off into such wild talking. I don't believe you've done so very wrong. You say you have not, and I believe you. That horrid man has managed to get you involved in some way, but I am sure papa could set it to rights, if you would only make a friend of him, and tell him all. No, Molly, said Cynthia, I can't, and there's an end of it. You may, if you like, only let me leave the house first. Give me that much time. You know I would never tell anything you wished me not to tell, Cynthia, said Molly, deeply hurt. Would you not, darling? said Cynthia, taking her hand. Will you promise me that? Quite a sacred promise? For it would be such a comfort to me to tell you all, now you know so much. Yes, I'll promise not to tell. You should not have doubted me, said Molly, still a little sorrowfully. Very well, I trust to you. I know I may. But do think of telling papa, and getting him to help you, persevered Molly. Never, said Cynthia resolutely, but more quietly than before. Do you think I forget what he said at the time of that wretched Mr. Coxe, how severe he was, and how long I was in disgrace, if indeed I'm out of it now? I'm one of those people, as mamma says sometimes. I cannot live with persons who don't think well of me. It may be a weakness, or a sin, I'm sure I don't know, and I don't care, but I really cannot be happy in the same house with any one who knows my faults, and thinks that they are greater than my merits. Now you know your father would do that. I have often told you that he, and you too, Molly, had a higher standard than I had ever known. Oh, I couldn't bear it. If he were to know, he would be so angry with me, he would never get over it, and I have so liked him, I do so like him. Well, never mind, dear, he shall not know, said Molly, for Cynthia was again becoming hysterical. At least we'll say no more about it now. And you'll never say any more, never, promise me, said Cynthia, taking her hand eagerly. Never till you give me leave. Now do let me see if I cannot help you. Lie down on the bed, and I'll sit by you, and let us talk it over. But Cynthia sat down again in the chair by the dressing-table. When did it all begin? said Molly, after a long pause of silence. Long ago, 4 or 5 years. I was such a child to be left all to myself. It was the holidays, and mamma was away visiting, and the Donaldsons asked me to go with them to the Worcester festival. You can't fancy how pleasant it all sounded, especially to me. I had been shut up in that great dreary house at Ashcombe, where mamma had her school. It belonged to Lord Cumnor, and Mr. Preston, as his agent, had to see it all painted and papered. But besides that, he was very intimate with us. I believe mamma thought— No, I'm not sure about that, and I have enough blame to lay at her door, to prevent my telling you anything about that may be only fancy. Then she paused, and sat still for a minute or two, recalling the past. Molly was struck by the aged and careworn expression which had taken temporary hold of the brilliant and beautiful face. She could see from that how much Cynthia must have suffered from this hidden trouble of hers. Well, at any rate, we were intimate with him, and he came a great deal about the house, and knew as much as any one of mamma's affairs, and all the ins and outs of her life. I am telling you this in order that you may understand how natural it was for me to answer his questions, when he came one day and found me, not crying, for you know I am not much given to that, in spite of to-day's exposure of myself, but fretting and fuming, because, though mamma had written word I might go with the Donaldsons, she had never said how I was to get any money for the journey,
much less for anything of dress, and I had outgrown all my last year's frocks, and as for gloves and boots, in short, I really had hardly clothes decent enough for church."
"Why didn't you write to her and tell her all this?" said Molly, half afraid of appearing to cast blame by her very natural question.
"I wish I had her letter to show you. You must have seen some of mamma's letters, though. Don't you know how she always seems to leave out just the important point of every fact? In this case she descanted largely on the enjoyment she was having, and the kindness she was receiving, and her wish that I could have been with her, and her gladness that I too was going to have some pleasure. But the only thing that would have been of real use to me she left out, and that was where she was going to next. She mentioned that she was leaving the house she was stopping at the day after she wrote, and that she should be at home by a certain date. But I got the letter on a Saturday, and the festival began the next Tuesday."
"Poor Cynthia," said Molly.
"Still, if you had written, your letter might have been forwarded. I don't mean to be hard, only I do so dislike the thought of your ever having made a friend of that man."
"Ah," said Cynthia, sighing,
"how easy it is to judge rightly after one sees what evil comes from judging wrongly. I was only a young girl, hardly more than a child, and he was a friend to us then. Excepting mamma, the only friend I knew. The Donaldsons were only kind and good-natured acquaintances."
"I am sorry," said Molly, humbly.
"I have been so happy with papa. I hardly can understand how different it must have been with you." "Different? I should think so. The worry about money made me sick of my life. We might not say we were poor, it would have injured the school, but I would have stinted and starved if mamma and I had gone on happily together as we might have done, as you and Mr Gibson do. It was not the poverty, it was that she never seemed to care to have me with her. As soon as the holidays came round, she was off to some great house or another, and I dare say I was at a very awkward age to have me lounging about in the drawing-room when callers came. Girls at that age I was then are so terribly keen at scenting out motives, and putting in their disagreeable questions as to the little twistings and twirlings and vanishings of conversation. They've no distinct notion of what are the truths and falsehoods of polite life. At any rate, I was very much in mamma's way, and I felt it. Mr Preston seemed to feel it too for me, and I was very grateful to him for kind words and sympathetic looks, crumbs of kindness which would have dropped under your table unnoticed. So this day, when he came to see how the workmen were getting on, he found me in the deserted schoolroom, looking at my faded summer bonnet and some old ribbons I had been sponging, and half-worn-out gloves, a sort of rag fair spread out on the deal table. I was in a regular passion with only looking at that shabbiness. He said he was so glad to hear I was going to this festival with the Donaldsons. Old Betty, our servant, had told him the news, I believe. But I was so perplexed about money, and my vanity was so put out about my shabby dress, that I was in a pet and said I shouldn't go. He sat down on the table, and little by little he made me tell him all my troubles. I do sometimes think he was very nice in those days. Somehow I never felt as if it was wrong or foolish or anything to accept his offer of money at the time. He had £20 in his pocket, he said, and really he didn't know what to do with it, shouldn't want it for months. I could repay it, or rather mamma could, when it suited her. She must have known I should want money, and most likely thought I should apply to him. £20 wouldn't be too much, I must take it all, and so on. I knew, at least I thought I knew, that I should never spend £20, but I thought I could give him back what I didn't want, and so— well, that was the beginning. It doesn't sound so very wrong, does it, Molly?"
"No," said Molly, hesitatingly. She did not wish to make herself into a hard judge, and yet she did so dislike Mr Preston. Cynthia went on.
"Well, what with boots and gloves, and a bonnet and a mantle, and a white muslin gown, which was made for me before I left on Tuesday, and a silk gown that followed to the Donaldsons, and my journeys and all, there is very little left of the £20, especially when I found I must get a ball dress in Worcester, for we were all to go to the ball. Mrs Donaldson gave me my ticket, but she rather looked grave at my idea of going to the ball in my white muslin, which I had already worn 2 evenings at their house. Oh dear, how pleasant it must be to be rich! You know," continued Cynthia, smiling a very little, "I can't help being aware that I'm pretty, and that people admire me very much. I found it out first at the Donaldsons'. I began to think I did look pretty in my fine new clothes, and I saw that other people thought so too. I was certainly the belle of the house, and it was very pleasant to feel my power. The last day or two of that gay week Mr. Preston joined our party. The last time he had seen me was when I was dressed in shabby clothes too small for me, half crying in my solitude, neglected and penniless. At the Donaldsons' I was a little queen, and, as I said, fine feathers make fine birds, and all the people were making much of me, and at that ball, which was the first night he came, I had more partners than I knew what to do with. I suppose he really did fall in love with me then. I don't think he had done so before. And then I began to feel how awkward it was to be in his debt. I couldn't give myself airs to him as I did to others. Oh, it was so awkward and uncomfortable. But I liked him, and felt him as a friend all the time. The last day I was walking in the garden along with the others, and I thought I would tell him how much I had enjoyed myself, and how happy I had been, all thanks to his 20 pounds. I was beginning to feel like Cinderella when the clock was striking 12, and to tell him it should be repaid to him as soon as possible, though I turned sick at the thought of telling mamma, and knew enough of our affairs to understand how very difficult it would be to muster up the money. The end of our talk came very soon, for almost to my terror he began to talk violent love to me, and to beg me to promise to marry him. I was so frightened that I ran away to the others. But that night I got a letter from him, apologizing for startling me, renewing his offer, his entreaties for a promise of marriage, to be fulfilled at any date I would please to name, in fact a most urgent love letter, and in it a reference to my unlucky debt, which was to be a debt no longer, only in advance of the money to be hereafter mine, if only— You can fancy it all, Molly, better than I can remember it to tell you. "And what did you say?" asked Molly, breathless. I did not answer it at all, until another letter came, entreating for a reply. By that time mamma had come home, and the old daily pressure and plaint of poverty had come on. Mary Donaldson wrote to me often, singing the praises of Mr. Preston as enthusiastically as if she had been bribed to do it. I had seen him a very popular man in their set, and I liked him well enough, and felt grateful to him. So I wrote and gave him my promise to marry him when I was 20, but it was to be a secret till then. And I tried to forget I had ever borrowed money of him, but somehow as soon as I felt pledged to him I began to hate him. I couldn't endure his eagerness of greeting if he ever found me alone, and mamma began to suspect, I think. I cannot tell you all the ins and outs. In fact, I didn't understand them at the time, and I don't remember clearly how it all happened now. But I know that Lady Cuxhaven sent mamma some money to be applied to my education, as she called it, and mamma seemed very much put out and in very low spirits, and she and I didn't get on at all together. So, of course, I never ventured to name the hateful 20 pounds to her, but went on trying to think that if I was to marry Mr. Preston, it need never be paid. Very mean and wicked, I dare say. But oh, Molly, I've been punished for it, for how I abhor that man. But why? When did you begin to dislike him? You seem to have taken it very passively all this time. I don't know. It was growing upon me before I went to that school at Boulogne. He made me feel as if I was in his power, and by too often reminding me of my engagement to him, he made me critical of his words and ways. There was an insolence in his manner to mamma, too. Oh, you're thinking that I'm not too respectful a daughter, and perhaps not, but I couldn't bear his covert sneers at her faults, and I hated his way of showing what he called his love for me. Then, after I'd been a semestre at Madame Lefebvre's, a new English girl came, a cousin of his, who knew but little of me. Now, Molly, you must forget as soon as I've told you what I'm going to say. And she used to talk so much and perpetually about her cousin Robert. He was the great man of the family, evidently, and how he was so handsome, and every lady of the land in love with him, a lady of title into the bargain. Lady Harriet, I dare say, said Molly indignantly. I don't know, said Cynthia wearily. I didn't care at the time, and I don't care now, for she went on to say there was a very pretty widow, too, who made desperate love to him. He had often laughed with them at all her little advances, which she thought he didn't see through. And oh, and this was the man I had promised to marry, and gone into debt to, and written love letters to. So now you understand it all, Molly?" "No, I don't yet. What did you do on hearing how he had spoken about your mother?" "There was but one thing to do. I wrote and told him I hated him, and would never, never marry him, and would pay him back his money, and the interest on it, as soon as ever I could." "Well?" "And Madame Lefebvre brought me back my letter, unopened, I will say, and told me that she didn't allow letters to gentlemen to be sent by the pupils of her establishment, unless she had previously seen their contents. I told her he was a family friend, the agent who managed mamma's affairs. I really could not stick at the truth, but she wouldn't let it go, and I had to see her burn it, and to give her my promise I wouldn't write again before she would consent not to tell mamma. So I had to calm down, and wait till I came home." "But you didn't see him then, at least not for some time?" "No, but I could write, and I began to try and save up my money to pay him." "What did he say to your letter?" "Oh, at first he pretended not to believe I could be in earnest. He thought it was only pique, or a temporary offence to be apologized for, and covered over with passionate protestations." "And afterwards?" "He condescended to threats, and what is worse, then I turned coward. I couldn't bear to have it all known and talked about, and my silly letters shown. Oh, such letters! I cannot bear to think of them, beginning, 'My dearest Robert,' to that man." "But oh, Cynthia, how could you go and engage yourself to Roger?" asked Molly. "Why not?" said Cynthia, sharply turning round upon her. "I was free, I am free. It seemed a way of assuring myself that I was quite free, and I did like Roger. It was such a comfort to be brought into contact with people who could be relied upon, and I was not a stock or a stone that I could fail to be touched with his tender, unselfish love, so different to Mr. Preston's. I know you don't think me good enough for him, and of course if this all comes out he won't think me good enough either," falling into a plaintive tone very touching to hear. "And sometimes I think I'll give him up, and go off to some fresh life amongst strangers, and once or twice I've thought I would marry Mr. Preston out of pure revenge, and have him for ever in my power. Only I think I should have the worst of it, for he is very cruel in his soul, tigerish, with his beautiful striped skin and relentless heart. I have so begged and begged him to let me go without exposure." "Never mind the exposure," said Molly. "It will recoil far more on him than harm you." Cynthia went a little paler. "But I said things in those letters about mamma. I was quick-eyed enough to all her faults, and hardly understood the force of her temptations. And he says he will show those letters to your father, unless I consent to acknowledge our engagement." "He shall not," said Molly, rising up in her indignation, and standing before Cynthia almost as resolutely fierce as if she were in the very presence of Mr. Preston himself. "I am not afraid of him. He dare not insult me, or if he does, I don't care. I will ask him for those letters, and see if he will dare to refuse me." "You don't know him," said Cynthia, shaking her head. "He has made many an appointment with me, just as if he would take back the money, which has been sealed up ready for him this 4 months, or as if he would give me back my letters. Poor, poor Roger! How little he thinks of all this! When I want to write words of love to him, I pull myself up, for I have written words as affectionate to that other man. And if Mr. Preston ever guessed that Roger and I were engaged, he would manage to be revenged on both him and me, by giving us as much pain as he could with those unlucky letters, written when I was not 16, Molly, only 7 of them. They are like a mine under my feet, which may blow up any day, and down will come father and mother and all." She ended bitterly enough, though her words were so light. "How can I get them?" said Molly, thinking. "Forget them I will. With papa to back me, he dare not refuse." "Ah, but that's just the thing. He knows I'm afraid of your father's hearing of it all, more than of any one else." "And yet he thinks he loves you." "It is his way of loving. He says often enough he doesn't care what he does, so that he gets me to be his wife, and that after that he is sure he can make me love him." Cynthia began to cry, out of weariness of body and despair of mind. Molly's arms were round her in a minute, and she pressed the beautiful head to her bosom,
and laid her own cheek upon it, and hushed her up with lulling words, just as if Cynthia were a little child. "Oh, it is such a comfort to have told you all," murmured Cynthia. And Molly made reply, "I am sure we have right on our side, and that makes me certain he must and shall give up the letters." "And take the money?" added Cynthia, lifting up her head, and looking eagerly into Molly's face. "He must take the money. Oh, Molly, you can never manage at all without its coming out to your father. And I would far rather go out to Russia as a governess. I almost think I would rather— No, not that," said she, shuddering away from what she was going to say. "But he must not know. Please, Molly, he must not know. I couldn't bear it. I don't know what I might not do. You'll promise me never to tell him, or mamma?" "I never will. You do not think I would for anything short of saving—" She was going to have said, "saving you and Roger from pain." But Cynthia broke in, "For nothing, no reason whatever must make you tell your father. If you fail, you fail, and I will love you for ever for trying, but I shall be no worse off than before. Better indeed, for I shall have the comfort of your sympathy. But promise me not to tell Mr. Gibson." "I have promised once," said Molly, "but I promise again. So now do go to bed and try and rest. You are looking as white as a sheet. You'll be ill if you don't get some rest, and it's past 2 o'clock, and you're shivering with cold." So they wished each other good night. But when Molly got into her room all her spirit left her, and she threw herself down on her bed, dressed as she was, for she had no heart left for anything. If Roger ever heard of it all by any chance, she felt how it would disturb his love for Cynthia. And yet was it right to conceal it from him? She must try and persuade Cynthia to tell it all straight out to him as soon as he returned to England. A full confession on her part would wonderfully lessen any pain he might have on first hearing of it. She lost herself in thoughts of Roger, how he would feel, what he would say, how that meeting would come to pass, where he was at that very time, and so on, till she suddenly plucked herself up, and recollected what she herself had offered and promised to do. Now that the first fervour was over, she saw the difficulties clearly, and the foremost of all was how she was to manage to have an interview with Mr. Preston. How had Cynthia managed? And the letters that had passed between them too? Unwillingly Molly was compelled to perceive that there must have been a great deal of underhand work going on beneath Cynthia's apparent openness of behaviour, and still more unwillingly she began to be afraid that she herself might be led into the practice. But she would try and walk in a straight path, and if she did wander out of it, it should only be to save pain to those whom she loved. End of chapter 43.
Wives and Daughters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 44. Molly Gibson to the rescue. It seemed curious enough, after the storms of the night, to meet in smooth tranquillity at breakfast. Cynthia was pale, but she talked as quietly as usual about all manner of indifferent things, while Molly sat silent, watching and wondering, and becoming convinced that Cynthia must have gone through a long experience of concealing her real thoughts and secret troubles before she could have been able to put on such a semblance of composure. Among the letters that came in that morning was one from the London Kirkpatricks, but not from Helen, Cynthia's own particular correspondent. Her sister wrote to apologize for Helen, who was not well, she said. She had the influenza, which had left her very weak and poorly. "Let her come down here for a change of air," said Mr. Gibson. "The country at this time of the year is better than London, except when the place is surrounded by trees. Now our house is well drained, high up, gravel soil, and I'll undertake to doctor her for nothing." "It would be charming," said Mrs. Gibson, rapidly revolving in her mind the changes necessary in her household economy before receiving a young lady accustomed to such a household as Mr. Kirkpatrick's, calculating the consequent inconveniences, and weighing them against the probable advantages, even while she spoke. "Should not you like it, Cynthia, and Molly too?
You, then, dear, would become acquainted with one of the girls, and I have no doubt you would be asked back again, which would be so very nice." "And I shouldn't let her go," said Mr. Gibson, who had acquired an unfortunate facility of reading his wife's thoughts. "Dear Helen," went on Mrs. Gibson, "I should so like to nurse her. We would make your consulting room into her own private sitting room, my dear." It is hardly necessary to say that the scales had been weighed down by the inconveniences of having a person behind the scenes for several weeks. "For with an invalid so much depends on tranquillity. In the drawing-room, for instance, she might constantly be disturbed by callers, and the dining-room is what shall I call it? So dinnery. The smell of meals never seems to leave it. It would have been different if dear papa had allowed me to throw out that window." "Why can't she have the dressing-room for her bedroom, and the little room opening out of the drawing-room for her sitting-room?" asked Mr. Gibson. "The library," for by this name Mrs. Gibson chose to dignify what had formerly been called the book-closet, "why, it would hardly hold a sofa, besides the books and the writing-table, and there are draughts everywhere. No, my dear, we had better not ask her at all. Her own home is comfortable, at any rate." "Well, well," said Mr. Gibson, seeing he was to be worsted, and not caring enough about the matter to show fight. "Perhaps you're right. It's a case of luxury versus fresh air. Some people suffer more from want of the one than from want of the other. You know I shall be glad to see her if she likes to come, and take us as we are, but I can't give up the consulting room. It's a necessity, our daily bread." "I'll write and tell them how kind Mr. Gibson is," said his wife in high contentment, as her husband left the room. "They'll be just as much obliged to him as if she had come." Whether it was Helen's illness, or from some other cause, after breakfast Cynthia became very flat and absent, and this lasted all day. Molly understood now why her moods had been so changeable for many months, and was tender and forbearing with her accordingly. Towards evening, when the two girls were left alone, Cynthia came and stood over Molly, so that her face could not be seen. "Molly," said she, "will you do it? Will you do what you said last night? I've been thinking of it all day, and sometimes I believe he would give you back the letters if you asked him. He might fancy, at any rate it's worth trying, if you don't very much dislike it." Now it so happened that with every thought she had given to it, Molly disliked the idea of the proposed interview with Mr. Preston more and more. But it was after all her own offer, and she neither could nor would draw back from it. It might do good, she did not see how it could possibly do harm. So she gave her consent, and tried to conceal her distaste, which grew upon her more and more as Cynthia hastily arranged the details. "You shall meet him in the avenue leading from the Park Lodge up to the Towers. He can come in one way from the Towers, where he often has business. He has pass-keys everywhere. You can go in as we have often done by the lodge. You need not go far." It did strike Molly that Cynthia must have had some experience in making all these arrangements, and she ventured to ask how he was to be informed of all this. Cynthia only reddened and replied, "Oh, never mind. He will only be too glad to come. You heard him say he wished to discuss the affair more. It is the first time the appointment has come from my side. If I can but once be free. Oh, Molly, I will love you and be grateful to you all my life." Molly thought of Roger, and that thought prompted her next speech. "It must be horrible. I think I'm very brave, but I don't think I could have accepted even Roger with a half-cancelled engagement hanging over me." She blushed as she spoke. "You forget how I detest Mr. Preston," said Cynthia. "It was that, more than any excess of love for Roger, that made me thankful to be at least as securely pledged to someone else. He did not want to call it an engagement, but I did, because it gave me the feeling of assurance that I was free from Mr. Preston. And so I am, all but these letters. Oh, if you can but make him take back his abominable money, and get me my letters! Then we would bury it all in oblivion, and he could marry somebody else, and I would marry Roger, and no one would be the wiser. After all, it was only what people call youthful folly. And you may tell Mr. Preston that as soon as he makes my letters public, shows them to your father, or anything, I'll go away from Hollingford and never come back." loaded with many such messages, which she felt that she should never deliver, not really knowing what she should say, hating the errand, not satisfied with Cynthia's manner of speaking about her relations to Roger, oppressed with shame and complicity in conduct which appeared to her deceitful, yet willing to bear all and brave all, if she could once set Cynthia in a straight path, in a clear space, and almost more pitiful to her friend's great distress and possible disgrace, than able to give her that love which involves perfect sympathy, Molly set out on her walk towards the appointed place. It was a cloudy, blustering day, and the noise of the blowing wind among the nearly leafless branches of the great trees filled her ears, as she passed through the park gates and entered the avenue. She walked quickly, instinctively wishing to get her blood up, and have no time for thought. But there was a bend in the avenue about a quarter of a mile from the lodge. After that bend it was a straight line up to the great house, now emptied of its inhabitants. Molly did not like going quite out of sight of the lodge, and she stood facing it, close by the trunk of one of the trees. Presently she heard a step coming over the grass. It was Mr. Preston. He saw a woman's figure half behind the trunk of a tree, and made no doubt that it was Cynthia. But when he came nearer, almost close, the figure turned round, and instead of the brilliantly coloured face of Cynthia, he met the pale, resolved look of Molly. She did not speak to greet him, but though he felt sure from the general aspect of pallor and timidity that she was afraid of him, her steady grey eyes met his with courageous innocence. "Is Cynthia unable to come?" asked he, perceiving that she expected him. "I did not know that you thought you should meet her," said Molly, a little surprised. In her simplicity she had believed that Cynthia had named that it was she, Molly Gibson, who would meet Mr. Preston at a given time and place. But Cynthia had been too worldly wise for that, and had decoyed him thither by a vaguely worded note, which, while avoiding actual falsehood, had led him to believe that she herself would give him the meeting. "She said she should be here," said Mr. Preston, extremely annoyed at being entrapped, as he now felt that he had been, into an interview with Miss Gibson. Molly hesitated a little before she spoke. He was determined not to break the silence. As she had intruded herself into the affair, she should find her situation as awkward as possible. "At any rate, she sent me here to meet you," said Molly. "She has told me exactly how matters stand between you and her." "Has she?" sneered he. "She is not always the most open or reliable person in the world." Molly reddened. She perceived the impertinence of the tone, and her temper was none of the coolest. But she mastered herself, and gained courage by so doing. "You should not speak so of the person you profess to wish to have for your wife. But, putting all that aside, you have some letters of hers that she wishes to have back again." "I dare say." "And that you have no right to keep." "No legal or no moral right? Which do you mean?" "I do not know. Simply you have no right at all as a gentleman to keep a girl's letters when she asks for them back again, much less to hold them over her as a threat." "I see you do know all, Miss Gibson," said he, changing his manner to one of more respect. "At least she has told you her story from her point of view, her side. Now you must hear mine. She promised me as solemnly as ever woman—" "She was not a woman. She was only a girl, barely 16.
old enough to know what she was doing. But I'll call her a girl if you like. She promised me solemnly to be my wife, making the one stipulation of secrecy and a certain period of waiting. She wrote me letters repeating this promise, and confidential enough to prove that she considered herself bound to me by such an implied relation. I don't give in to humbug, I don't set myself up as a saint, and in most ways I can look after my own interests pretty keenly. You know enough of her position as a penniless girl, and at that time, with no influential connections to take the place of wealth, and help me on in the world. It was as sincere and unworldly a passion as ever man felt. She must say so herself. I might have married 2 or 3 girls with plenty of money. One of them was handsome enough, and not at all reluctant."
Molly interrupted him. She was chafed at the conceit of his manner. "I beg your pardon, but I do not want to hear accounts of young ladies whom you might have married. I come here simply on behalf of Cynthia, who does not like you, and who does not wish to marry you."
"Well, then, I must make her like me, as you call it.
She did like me once, and made promises which she will find it requires the consent of two people to break. I don't despair of making her love me as much as ever she did, according to her letters at least, when we are married." "She will never marry you," said Molly firmly. "Then, if she ever honors anyone else with her preference, he shall be allowed the perusal of her letters to me." Molly almost could have laughed, she was so secure and certain that Roger would never read letters offered to him under these circumstances; but then she thought that he would feel such pain at the whole affair, and at the contact with Mr. Preston, especially if he had not heard of it from Cynthia first, and if she, Molly, could save him pain, she would. Before she could settle what to say, Mr. Preston spoke again. "You said the other day that Cynthia was engaged. May I ask whom to?" "No," said Molly, "you may not. You heard her say it was not an engagement. It is not exactly, and if it were a full engagement, do you think, after what you last said, I should tell you to whom? But you may be sure of this, he would never read a line of your letters. He is no, I won't speak of him before you. You could never understand him." "It seems to me that this mysterious he is a very fortunate person, to have such a warm defender in Miss Gibson, to whom he is not at all engaged," said Mr. Preston, with so disagreeable a look on his face that Molly suddenly found herself on the point of bursting into tears. But she rallied herself, and worked on, for Cynthia first, and for Roger as well. "No honourable man or woman will read your letters, and if any people do read them, they will be so much ashamed of it that they won't dare to speak of them. What use can they be to you?" "They contain Cynthia's reiterated promises of marriage," replied he. "She says she would rather leave Hollingford for ever, and go out to earn her bread, than marry you." His face fell a little. He looked so bitterly mortified that Molly was almost sorry for him. "Does she say that to you in cold blood? Do you know you were telling me very hard truths, Miss Gibson? If they are truths, that is to say," he continued, recovering himself a little. "Young ladies are very fond of the words hate and detest. I've known many who have applied them to men whom they were all the time hoping to marry." "I cannot tell about other people," said Molly. "I only know that Cynthia does—" Here she hesitated for a moment. She felt for his pain, and so she hesitated, but then she brought it out. "Does as nearly hate you as anybody like her ever does hate." "Like her?" said he, repeating the words almost unconsciously, seizing on anything to try and hide his mortification. "I mean, I should hate worse," said Molly in a low voice. But he did not attend much to her answer. He was working the point of his stick into the turf, and his eyes were bent on it. "So, now, would you mind sending her back the letters by me? I do assure you that you cannot make her marry you." "You are very simple, Miss Gibson," said he, suddenly lifting up his head. "I suppose you don't know that there is any other feeling that can be gratified except love. Have you never heard of revenge? Cynthia has cajoled me with promises, and little as you or she may believe me, well, it's no use speaking of that. I don't mean to let her go unpunished. You may tell her that. I shall keep the letters, and make use of them as I see fit when the occasion arises." Molly was miserably angry with herself for her mismanagement of the affair. She had hoped to succeed, she had only made matters worse. What new argument should she use? Meanwhile he went on, lashing himself up as he thought how the two girls must have talked him over, bringing in wounded vanity to add to the rage of disappointed love. "Mr. Osborne Hamley may hear of their contents, though he may be too honourable to read them. Nay, even your father may hear whispers, and if I remember them rightly, Miss Cynthia Kirkpatrick does not always speak in the most respectful terms of the lady who is now Mrs. Gibson. There are—" "Stop," said Molly. "I won't hear anything out of these letters, written when she was almost without friends, to you, whom she looked upon as a friend. But I have thought of what I will do next. I will give you fair warning. If I had not been foolish, I should have told my father, but Cynthia made me promise that I would not. So I will tell it all, from beginning to end, to Lady Harriet, and ask her to speak to her father. I feel sure that she will do it, and I don't think you will dare to refuse Lord Cumnor." He felt at once that he should not dare, that, clever land agent as he was, and high up in the Earl's favour on that account, yet that the conduct of which he had been guilty in regard to the letters, and the threats which he had held out respecting them, were just what no gentleman, no honourable man, no manly man, could put up with in any one about him. He knew that much, and wondered how she, the girl standing before him, had been clever enough to find it out. He forgot himself for an instant in admiration of her. There she stood, frightened yet brave, not letting go her hold on what she meant to do, even when things seemed most against her. And besides, there was something that struck him most of all perhaps, and which shows the kind of man he was. He perceived that Molly was as unconscious that he was a young man and she a young woman as if she had been a pure angel of heaven. Though he felt that he would have to yield and give up the letters, he was not going to do it at once, and while he was thinking what to say, so as still to evade making any concession till he had had time to think it over, he, with his quick senses all about him, heard the trotting of a horse crunching quickly along over the gravel of the drive. A moment afterwards Molly's perception overtook his. He could see the startled look overspread her face, and in an instant she would have run away, but before the first rush was made, Mr. Preston laid his hand firmly on her arm. "Keep quiet. You must be seen. You, at any rate, have done nothing to be ashamed of." As he spoke, Mr. Sheepshanks came round the bend of the road, and was close upon them. Mr. Preston saw, if Molly did not, the sudden look of intelligence that dawned upon the shrewd, ruddy face of the old gentleman, saw, but did not much heed. He went forwards and spoke to Mr. Sheepshanks, who made a halt right before them. "Miss Gibson, your servant. Rather a blustering day for a young lady to be out, and cold, I should say, for standing still too long. Preston?" poking his whip at the latter in a knowing manner. "Yes," said Mr. Preston, "and I'm afraid I have kept Miss Gibson too long standing." Molly did not know what to say or do. She only bowed a silent farewell, and turned away to go home, feeling very heavy at heart at the non-success of her undertaking. For she did not know how she had conquered, in fact, although Mr. Preston might not yet acknowledge it even to himself. Before she was out of hearing, she heard Mr. Sheepshanks say, "Sorry to have disturbed your tête-à-tête, Preston." But though she heard the words, their implied sense did not sink into her mind. She was only feeling how she had gone out glorious and confident, and was coming back to Cynthia defeated. Cynthia was on the watch for her return, and rushing downstairs, dragged Molly into the dining-room. "Well, Molly? Oh, I see you haven't got them. After all, I never expected it." She sat down as if she could get over her disappointment better in that position, and Molly stood like a guilty person before her. "I am so sorry. I did all I could. We were interrupted at last. Mr. Sheepshanks rode up." "Provoking old man! Do you think you should have persuaded him to give up the letters, if you had had more time?" "I don't know. I wish Mr. Sheepshanks hadn't come up just then. I didn't like his finding me standing talking to Mr. Preston." "Oh, I dare say he'll never think anything about it. What did Mr. Preston, say?" "He seemed to think you were fully engaged to him, and that these letters were the only proof he had. I think he loves you in his way." "His way, indeed!" said Cynthia scornfully. "The more I think of it, the more I see it would be better for papa to speak to him. I did say I would tell it all to Lady Harriet, and get Lord Cumnor to make him give up the letters, but it would be very awkward." "Very," said Cynthia gloomily. "But he would see it was only a threat." "But I will do it in a moment, if you like. I meant what I said, only I feel that papa would manage it best of all, and more privately. I'll tell you what, Molly. You're bound by a promise, you know, and cannot tell Mr. Gibson without breaking your solemn word. But it's just this. I'll leave Hollingford and never come back again, if ever your father hears of this affair. There!" Cynthia stood up now, and began to fold up Molly's shawl in her nervous excitement. "Oh, Cynthia, Roger!" was all that Molly said. "Yes, I know. You need not remind me of him. But I'm not going to live in the house with any one who may be always casting up in his mind the things he had heard against me, things, faults, perhaps, which sound so much worse than they really are. I was so happy when I first came here. You all liked me and admired me, and thought well of me, and now— Why, Molly, I can see the difference in you already. You carry your thoughts in your face. I have read them there these 2 days. You've been thinking, how Cynthia must have deceived me, keeping up a correspondence all this time, having half engagements to 2 men. You've been more full of that than of pity for me as a girl who has always been obliged to manage for herself, without any friend to help her and protect her. Molly was silent. There was a great deal of truth in what Cynthia was saying, and yet a great deal of falsehood. For, through all this long 48 hours, Molly had loved Cynthia dearly, and had been more weighed down by the position the latter was in than Cynthia herself. She also knew, but this was a second thought following on the other, that she had suffered much pain in trying to do her best in this interview with Mr. Preston. She had been tried beyond her strength, and the great tears welled up into her eyes, and fell slowly down her cheeks. "Oh, what a brute I am!" said Cynthia, kissing them away. "I see, I know it is the truth, and I deserve it, but I need not reproach you." "You did not reproach me," said Molly, trying to smile. "I have thought something of what you said, but I do love you dearly, dearly, Cynthia. I should have done just the same as you did." "No, you would not. Your grain is different somehow." End of chapter 44.